Hello, this is Kate Fall with Moore County Schools, and today we're going to learn how to use Excel pivot tables to help you summarize and analyze large chunks of data in a meaningful way. What is a pivot table? A pivot table is a powerful Excel tool that is used to quickly summarize large chunks of data. It allows you to count, calculate, summarize, and analyze data with a few clicks of the mouse. It will make finding patterns and trends in your data a million times easier. As an example of what Excel pivot tables can do, let's look at some sample discipline data. In this case, we've downloaded the offenders list from Educator's Handbook and want to do some deeper analysis of the data. So here's our source data. There are 120 incidences at school, but as you can see, the amount of information we have here is almost frightening and almost impossible to do any meaningful analysis with. That's where pivot tables come in. This is a simple pivot table that counts up the number of offenders by grade level. It takes all 120 offenses and lists out how many were in 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade, therefore giving you a quick count of how many by each grade level. Knowing the grades that are offending is great, but knowing what those grades are doing is even more powerful. Here's a pivot table that shows you a list of infractions down the left-hand side by grade level along the top. The pivot table automatically lists out all the infractions that are on the source data. If it's on the source data even one time, it appears on the list. Then along the top are the grade levels. So you can see that 7th grade has the most infractions and the most infractions of disruptive behavior. You can also see that disruptive behavior and disrespect are big issues with 7th and 8th graders. Please notice the grand total line for both the column and the row. You will always have a grand total column and row when you do a pivot table. This gives you a point of reference for the rest of the data. You can get even more detailed with the data looking at 3 or more points of data at a single time. Here is the same information as before, offender by infraction and grade, but we've added race to the data. As you can see, the race is listed on the top and the grades are broken down underneath that. So there was only a 7th grade Asian student here, Black, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, Hispanic, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, Indian, 6th and 7th, multiracial, 6, 7, and 8, and then white, 6, 7, and 8. You will see that the race is broken down by grade and then summarized in the shaded column. So here's the total number of Asian infractions, the total number of Black, Hispanic, etc. Here we were focused on the race and then a breakdown by grade. However, if we wanted to flip that and focus on the grade first and then the race, we would simply flip the pivot table to do so. Now you're looking at 6th grade and then the racial breakdown of 6th grade offenders, 7th grade and the racial breakdown of 7th grade offenders plus your totals, and then your 8th grade broken down by the number of offenders. The real power in pivot tables is the ability to quickly identify points of focus within the data. For example, it's evident by this pivot table showing that infractions and grade levels that inappropriate behavior is an issue school-wide. By simply clicking on the number of inappropriate behaviors, you will quickly see those 21 infractions. Essentially, what this does is pre-filter the information for you. It's everything on the source data table, but narrowed down only to the data that you're interested in, the number that you double-clicked. In this case, all the inappropriate behavior infractions. Now you can really look at the incidence of inappropriate behavior and do some deeper analysis. Also note that it opens the data on a separate tab so you can work with just the information you're interested in and you won't lose it when you go back to the original pivot table. So now that you know what pivot tables are, let's learn how to build one. It's important to note that pivot table tools looks a little different depending on what version of Excel you are using. However, the functionality is the same. You can also do pivot tables in Google Sheets, but it is not user-friendly and does not auto-format for you. For those reasons, we recommend using Excel for pivot table work. Everything you need to know about pivot tables can be summarized with 4 boxes, the pivot grid. First, the top left box you're not ever going to use, so just forget it exists. The top right box is where you put the columns. This is the box for the data that you want across the top of your table. The bottom left is your rows. This is the box where you're entering the information you want to populate down the left-hand side of your table. The bottom right box is the values. This is what are you counting? What are you focusing on? This box is the most confusing for people because it can use just about any field and get the same total. A good rule of thumb is to put whatever is in your column data here as well. I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. So if you understand those three boxes, you can do pivot tables. To build a pivot table, you start with your original source data. You must make sure that you have a heading in every column of the data or the pivot will not work. So across this whole list of data, there has to be a heading in every box. Highlight your original data. Make sure that you grab all the columns and rows. You can do this by selecting Control-A on a PC or Command-A on a Mac. Once the data is highlighted, select Insert in the top left corner, and then Pivot Tables to the far left. An Excel wizard will appear to try to walk you through the process. Most of the time, you will hit OK without changing any settings. Once you do, a new worksheet pops up to the left of the original worksheet and source data. Now you can see where the pivot table will be built on the left and the building tools on the right. On the tools, you will see a list of every column header on your original data, and under that, the building boxes from earlier. Remember, you will ignore the top left box labeled filters. To build a table, simply click and drag the heading you are interested in into the appropriate box. For example, we can drag a fence down to rows to list them down your left-hand side. Remember, if it appears even once on the original source data, it will appear here. Then we can drag race to the columns and list them across the top. So race comes across the top. As I said before, it doesn't really matter what you put in the values because what the system is doing is counting up the number of times that the column and row criteria match. For example, if I drop the header school to values, it is counting up the number of times there is a school listed that meets the definition criteria. So school is listed one time for sexual harassment and Hispanic on the same line. Again, a good rule of thumb is to use the same header for columns and values. So in this case, I want to get rid of schools and replace it with race. To do that, I click and hold the schools under values and drag it off the grid and release the button. Then I can go and grab race and move it to the values box. That's it. The pivot table is done. To make it a little more reader-friendly, I like to add borders and center the data. To do that, I click on the pivot table itself, select Control-A to highlight the whole table, and then I go to the Home tab and add borders underneath the font. Then I highlight the columns, center the data, and adjust the column width. By the way, if your pivot grid disappears, notice it's no longer on the right-hand side, it's because you clicked off the pivot table. To get it back, simply click anywhere on the pivot table, and a pivot grid will pop back up on the right-hand side. Let's build another pivot table. We can go back to our Fender original source data, highlight everything. Again, I use Control-A. Select Insert in the top left corner. Select Pivot from the pivot table from the top left corner. When the Excel wizard pops up, just hit OK, and away we go. This time, let's look to see if there's any correlation between race and the subject being taught during an infraction. To do that, we will drag subject to the columns and the value. Note, you have to drag these separately. Then drag race to your rows. Here's our final results. The same 120 infractions, but this time broken down by subject and race. Now, I personally find this pivot table hard to read because the column tables are so long that I lose track of what I'm reviewing. Personally, I'd rather have the subjects lifted down the left-hand side and the race listed across the top. To me, this makes it easier to analyze the data. So to fix this, it's as simple as dragging the column header to the row box and the row heading to the column box. Now the rows are labeled with the subject and the race, subject on the side and the race count across the top. Some people prefer to look at data as a subsection of each other. For example, if I drag the race column back to rows, I'll be looking at the subject, then under it, the race. So in art class, there were 4 infractions, 1 by a black student, 3 by a white student. CTE had 6 infractions. You can 1 black, 1 Hispanic, 1 Native American, and 3 white. You can even use the plus minus boxes next to it to shrink the data that you're not interested in, so you're only looking at the summary. So if I go through and click it like this, now I'm looking at my overall 120 infractions, and I'm looking at only the detailed broken down data for the core subjects. I can also switch the order of the rows to show race and then a breakdown by subject. To do this, I simply click and drag and drop the subject below race. Now I can see what subjects each race is getting in trouble in. Again, you can use those plus and minus buttons to shrink down to only the races that you're interested in exploring. But it gives you a quick way to see where your students are getting in trouble. Let's do one more simple pivot. Go back to the offender's original data source, highlight everything, select Insert, select Pivot Table. Hit OK when the pop-up comes up. This time, let's look at race and grade. Drag the race to the row to list the various races down the left-hand side. Then take the grade and drag it to columns and then again to values. Notice that it appears as if the number of infractions is much larger than the 120 that are on the source data. But if you look down at the value box in the very bottom right-hand corner, you can see that the value says sum of grade. This happens when the information you are counting is made up of numbers instead of text. In this case, in the grade column, there is either a 6, 7, or 8 marking the grade levels. The pivot table is adding those numbers up instead of counting the number of times that those numbers appear. This is an easy fix. Click on the caret next to the sum of grade in the very bottom right-hand corner and select Value Field Settings from the bottom of that screen. This screen looks different in the various versions of Excel, but they are all similar to the one shown here. You can see the Summary Value tab, and Sum is listed. Change Sum to Count and select OK. Now you can see that it is counting up the number of times 6th graders appear and not adding all the 6th graders together. I know it's correct because my grand total is 120. The Value Field Setting button is pretty powerful. From here, you can have the values you are working with count occurrences, counting up the number of times that the item appears, add up, as you would if you wanted to show how many instructional days were lost due to suspensions. You can also get it to show the average or the max if you were working with class size averages, for example. Additionally, you can have it show you the results as a percent of the total, the row, or the column. Let's try that. We have our pivot table built showing the offenders by race and grade. But what percent of the total are 6th grade black students? 9 students out of 120, what percent? To do this, we go back down to the bottom right-hand corner and go to the values box. We select the caret next to count of grades, select Value Field Settings to show the selection tab. Notice there's Show Values As tab. Click on that. You'll see Show Value As No Calculation. Select the drop-down, select percent of grand total, and select OK. Now I can quickly see that of my 120 infractions, 7.5% were black 6th grade students. I can also see that 20.83% were white 7th grade students, helping me quickly identify what area I need to target. This is sometimes a good way to look at data if you have smaller subgroup populations. You can set the value field setting to percent of column total. Again, count of grade, value field settings, show values as tab, and change this to percent of column total. This shows you that of all the sixth grade offenders, 36% were Black. It reads down the column, and you can tell because the grand total for each column is a 100%. You can also set the value to show you the percent of the row total. Again, values, value field setting, show value add, and this time percent of row total. This shows you that of the Black offenders, 61.9% were eighth graders. You know that the values are set to percent of roll because the grand total for each row is 100%. That's it. That's pivot tables. If you have data in Excel, then 4 clicks can get you to some powerful data analysis quickly. Drag and drop your way to deep data dives. There is no wrong way to do a pivot table. It just takes practice. If you need any assistance with pivot tables, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Planning, Accountability, and Research departments. Thank you and have a good day. Good luck with pivots.